Okay, so nobody really likes to think about disasters, but like being prepared, it can actually make a big difference. Have you ever wondered how your community handles those big emergencies? Well, today we're going deep into Frederick County, Virginia's Emergency Operations Plan.
Oh, this is interesting stuff. We're using their 2024 basic plan, and get this, it's publicly available online, so like transparency points for them.
Yeah, totally. It's like a peek behind the curtain at how they get ready for everything. I mean, from floods to cyber attacks. You'll find some surprising things that just might change how you think about safety and, well, resilience. So get ready because this is about to get real.
And this isn't just for first responders. This plan impacts everyone who lives in Frederick County. That includes you.
Exactly. Okay, so first things first, let's set the scene. The plan starts with like a situation overview of Frederick County. We're talking Shenandoah Valley, about 75 miles from D.C. And get this, it's actually a designated area of refuge for major incidents in the region.
That's right. Imagine a huge event in D.C., or even a problem at the North Anna power station.
Yeah.
People could be evacuating to Frederick County. I mean, that would put a real strain on their resources. The EOP, it has to account for that.
Wow. So they're not just handling their own emergencies, but like potentially those of surrounding areas too. Talk about pressure. Plus, they've seen huge population growth, 8% in the last decade. That's wild.
And think about the logistics of that growth. 24 non-English languages are spoken just in their school system. How do you communicate effectively during a crisis with, that kind of diversity?
That's a great point. It makes you realize how complex this all gets. Speaking of complex, the hazard analysis section, it lays out all the potential threats to the county.
It reads like a disaster movie script,
Yeah.
but it's all too real. Floods, winter storms, even dam failures. But what I find really interesting is they include things like drought and cyber events. They're not as flashy as a hurricane, but they can be just as disruptive.
Yeah, drought especially makes sense in the Shenandoah Valley. Agriculture and water resources, they're huge there. But cyber events, that seems kind of out of place.
Not at all. Imagine a hacker shutting down, like, the power grids or communication networks. Chaos. Today, a cyber attack can be as devastating as a natural disaster. It's a vulnerability that every community needs to address.
Okay, that makes sense in our digital world. So they've identified all these scary hazards. What next?
Well, that brings us to the planning assumptions section. This is where things get really thought-provoking. These are the underlying beliefs that shape their entire response strategy.
Such as?
Well, one that stood out to me was the statement, the county must be prepared to bear the initial impact of a disaster on its own. It's a sobering reminder that help from the state or federal government, it might not arrive immediately.
So self-reliance is key.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder what practical steps residents can take now to prepare for that initial, period of isolation.
Absolutely. Think about it. If communication systems are overwhelmed, as the plan assumes they will be, how would you connect with loved ones? Where would you go?
Those are some big questions. Maybe having a family communication plan is a good first step.
Definitely. Designate an out-of-area contact everyone can check in with. Consider things like ham radios or even written notes if phones are down. And most importantly, have a plan for where to meet if you get separated.
That's really practical advice. I can see how, diving into this plan can make preparedness feel less abstract and a lot more, well, actionable. So let's say a disaster does strike. What happens next? The EOP walks us through the concept of operations, breaking down emergency management into different phases.
It's like a well-choreographed dance, each phase addressing specific needs and challenges. They've really thought this through.
First up is normal operations, which seems kind of counterintuitive during a disaster. What are they doing on a regular day to prepare?
Think of it as laying the groundwork. They're constantly updating the EOP, training personnel, running drills, building relationships with other organizations. It's all about creating a strong foundation for a resilient emergency response system.
So they're not just sitting around waiting for something bad to happen. Then we move into the pre-incident phase. This is when a threat is identified, right?
Exactly. They rely heavily on the National Weather Service for weather-related threats, but they're also monitoring things like disease outbreaks, cyber activity, and potential civil unrest. It's all about staying ahead of the curve and anticipating potential problems.
So they're constantly gathering information and assessing risks.
And using a system called WebEOC to share information and track incidents. It's like their central nervous system for emergency management.
Okay, so the threat becomes real, and we enter the response phase. What happens then? What are the priorities?
Life safety comes first, always. That's followed by stabilizing the incident and then protecting property. It's a logical progression, you know. Save lives, get the situation under control, and then start addressing the damage.
Makes sense. So once the immediate crisis has passed, what does recovery look like in Frederick County?
The recovery phase is all about getting the community back on its feet. This includes repairing infrastructure, rebuilding homes and businesses, providing financial assistance, and addressing the long-term physical and mental health impacts of the disaster.
And then finally, there's a mitigation phase. What's the focus there?
This is where they take stock of what happened and try to prevent similar events from causing as much damage in the future. It's about learning from the experience and building back stronger.
So it's not just about reacting to disasters. It's about proactively trying to reduce their impact.
Exactly. They might strengthen building codes, improve infrastructure, or implement early warning systems. It's about creating a more resilient community. And to manage all of this, they have a dedicated Emergency Operations Center, or EOC. Think of it like a disaster movie command center, but in real life.
I'm picturing flashing screens, maps with little lights, people talking on headsets.
Pretty much. It's the central hub for coordinating all aspects of the emergency response. They even have backup locations, just in case the primary EOC is inaccessible.
Well, they've thought of everything. But who are all these people working in the EOC during a major event? It must take a whole army to manage a disaster of that scale.
It does, and they're organized very deliberately using a system called ICS, or Incident Command System. You have the command staff making the big decision, and then sections focused on operations, planning, logistics, and finance admin. Each section has specific roles and responsibilities, and they all work together seamlessly to manage the flow of information and resources.
Okay, that's the big picture. But I'd love to get a little more granular. Can we zoom in on one section? Maybe the planning section, to give our listeners a more concrete understanding of what goes on in the EOC.
Sure. Think of the planning section as the brains of the operation. They're the ones gathering information, analyzing the situation, and coming up with the Incident Action Plan, or IAP, which guides the entire response effort.
So they're basically figuring out how to solve a giant, constantly evolving puzzle.
Exactly. They're looking at damage assessments, weather forecasts, resource availability, transportation routes, communication status, public health concerns, you name it.
And coordinating with all the different agencies and organizations involved in the response. That sounds like a logistical nightmare.
It can be, but having a well-defined plan and a dedicated team, it makes all the difference. The EOC is like the heart of the emergency response system.
Which brings up an important point. This isn't just about government agencies, it's about everyone. The EOP emphasizes citizen involvement and the whole community concept.
Right. It's about recognizing that individuals and communities, they play a vital role in creating a resilient and responsive community.
So it's not just about waiting for instructions from officials.
Absolutely not. It's about being proactive, taking personal responsibility, and knowing that you have the power to make a difference.
I love that idea of empowerment.
Yeah.
But we've covered a lot of ground here. What are your initial thoughts? What stands out to you so far?
Honestly, I'm impressed by the level of detail and planning that's gone into this document. They've truly considered every angle, from the obvious threats to the more nuanced challenges.
It's fascinating, right? And we're just getting started. In part 2, we'll explore the roles of NGOs, volunteers, and the private sector, and most importantly, what you can do to be prepared. So stay tuned. Welcome back to our deep dive into Frederick County's Emergency Operations Plan. We left off talking about how important it is for citizens to be, involved in emergency preparedness.
Right. And it's not just individual preparedness either. The plan highlights the critical role that NGOs, volunteers, and even private businesses play in a community's response to a disaster.
Yeah, it's almost like this whole other layer of support that most people don't even think about.
Exactly. They're essential partners in this whole process. We're talking organizations like the Red Cross, the Salvation Army, groups that are ready to step in and provide essential services, like food, shelter, and medical aid when things go south.
And what about volunteers? I imagine they must be crucial, especially in those first, chaotic hours and days after a disaster.
Absolutely. Volunteers can do so much. Think about staffing shelters, distributing supplies, providing first aid, even searching for missing persons.
It's amazing how people just come together to help each other when things get tough.
It really is.
Yeah.
But the plan also recognizes that, all that good intention, it needs to be coordinated effectively. There's a whole section in the EOP about managing volunteers and donations, making sure the help gets to the right people in the most efficient way possible.
Makes sense. You wouldn't want, well-meaning volunteers showing up and accidentally creating more chaos. So we've got these incredible NGOs and an army of volunteers ready to help. What about the private sector? Where do businesses fit into all of this?
Believe it or not, the private sector has a huge role to play. Think about the resources they have. Trucks, heavy equipment, warehouses, communication networks, not to mention trained personnel who can be incredibly valuable during a crisis.
So they can help with logistics, transportation, maybe even provide temporary housing or communication services if needed.
You got it.
Right.
The plan actually encourages partnerships between the government and the private sector to make sure those resources are utilized effectively.
It's really starting to paint a picture of this interconnected web of support. Government agencies, NGOs, volunteers, private businesses, and of course, individual citizens all working together.
That's the whole community approach in action. Everyone has a role to play.
So let's bring it back to our listener for a second. What's one small step they can take today to be more prepared?
That's a great question. Honestly, the most important thing is just to start, thinking about it. Awareness is key. Take some time to familiarize yourself with the potential hazards in your area. And maybe even more importantly, have a conversation with your family about emergency preparedness.
Yeah, it's not about panicking or becoming a doomsday prepper. It's just about being informed and having a plan.
Exactly. It's about empowering yourself and your community to face whatever challenges might come your way.
Now, you mentioned earlier that the plan talks about equity and inclusion in emergency management. What does that mean in a practical sense?
It's a really important aspect that often gets overlooked. Essentially, it means recognizing that not everyone in the community is equally vulnerable to disasters. Some groups might face unique challenges in accessing help or recovering from an event.
So it's about making sure everyone has the support they need, regardless of their background or circumstances.
Precisely. The EOP emphasizes the importance of reaching out to and coordinating with diverse communities.
I imagine that includes people with disabilities, those who don't speak English, or folks who might have limited access to resources.
Absolutely. It's about leaving no one behind and ensuring that everyone has the information and resources they need to stay safe and recover.
This brings up another question. What are some unique challenges you think Frederick County might face in ensuring everyone is served equally during a crisis? We talked about the diversity of languages spoken in their school system. That alone seems like a major hurdle.
You're absolutely right. Effective communication is paramount. And with 24 non-English languages being spoken in the school system alone, that presents a real challenge.
What else comes to mind?
Well, think about the county's geography. You've got a mix of urban and rural areas with, varying levels of access to transportation, technology, and even basic infrastructure. Ensuring that emergency services can reach everyone in a timely and efficient manner, regardless of location, it's a huge consideration.
Right, you can't just assume everyone has a car or can easily get to a shelter.
Exactly. And then there's the issue of social vulnerability. Some populations, like low-income communities, the elderly, or people with disabilities, are often disproportionately affected by disasters. They might have fewer resources to prepare or recover, or they might face greater challenges in accessing help.
It's a complex problem with a lot of moving parts. It sounds like achieving true equity and inclusion in emergency management is an ongoing process.
It is. But it's also an essential one if you want to build a truly resilient community. After all, a chain is only as strong as its weakest link.
Okay, so we've talked about the what of the plan and the various players involved. Let's get into the how. I'm curious about a specific section of the plan called the Concept of Operations, or CONOPS. What exactly is that?
Think of it as the heart and soul of the EOP. It outlines how the county will actually manage emergencies from the very first sign of trouble all the way through recovery and mitigation. It's like a step-by-step playbook for action, but with a lot of built-in flexibility.
So they're not just, rigidly following a script. They're prepared to adjust their approach based on the situation.
Exactly. And one of the things that really stood out to me was the plan's emphasis on communication.
We talked earlier about how communication networks can be overloaded or even go down during a disaster. How does the CONOPS address that?
It stresses the importance of having redundant communication systems. So if one system fails, there's a backup. They also have plans for using, alternative communication methods like ham radio or even runners if necessary.
Rudders, wow, that's going old school.
Sometimes the simplest methods are the most reliable. The point is, they're not putting all their eggs in one basket. They're
Yeah.
prepared to use um, whatever means necessary to get information out to the public and coordinate response efforts.
It's impressive how much thought they've put into this, and I love that they're not just relying on technology.
Right. And speaking of thinking things through, one of the aspects I found most impressive about the Kono MPS was its focus on citizen involvement.
We've touched on that a few times already, about how important it is for citizens to be active participants in, emergency preparedness.
Right. But the Kono MPS takes it a step further. It actually outlines specific ways to engage citizens in the response and recovery process.
Like what?
Well, for example, it mentions the possibility of setting up call centers where people can report damage, request assistance, or get information. They're also big on training citizens in basic disaster preparedness skills.
So people aren't just sitting around waiting to be rescued. They're empowered to help themselves and their neighbors even before first responders arrive.
Exactly. It's about building a culture of self-reliance and community support. It's not about being afraid. It's about being prepared and knowing that you have the ability to make a difference.
It seems like there's a lot to unpack there, but we're running short on time for this part.
You're right. There are still so many fascinating details in the Frederick County EOP that we need to cover. But don't worry, we'll be back for part 3 where we'll explore those details and, what they mean for you.
Welcome back. We're wrapping up our deep dive into Frederick County's emergency operations plan. We've covered the who, the what, and even the how of their approach to disaster preparedness.
Right. From identifying potential hazards to coordinating a community-wide response, it's like they've really thought of everything.
But now it's time to get, really personal. What can our listeners do right here, right now, to feel more prepared for an emergency?
It's all about turning that knowledge into action. Remember that hazard analysis section we talked about? That's a great place to start. Familiarize yourself with the specific risks your community faces, whether it's severe weather, power outages, or even cyber threats.
Once you know what you're up against, you can start thinking about how to prepare.
Exactly. And one of the most important things you can do is have a plan. It doesn't have to be complicated, just a simple conversation with your family about what you would do in different scenarios.
Like deciding where you would meet if you got separated during an evacuation, or how you would communicate if, phones and the internet were down.
Exactly. Just having a plan in place can reduce stress and confusion during a crisis, and it can help you make better decisions.
It's like having a roadmap for, navigating the unknown. What else should people consider?
Having an emergency kit is essential. This should include basic supplies like food, water, a first aid kit, a flashlight, batteries, and any medications you or your family members might need.
Yeah, you can find tons of resources online about what to include in a basic kit. And don't forget about your pets.
That's right. They're part of the family, too. Make sure you have a plan and supplies for them as well.
We've talked a lot about communication being a major challenge during emergencies.
Right. So it's crucial to have backup options. A weather radio is a great investment. It can keep you informed even if the power is out. Also, think about, old school methods like having a designated out-of-town contact that everyone can check in with.
It all makes sense, but it can feel a little overwhelming. Where should people start if they're feeling lost?
Don't try to do everything at once. Small steps lead to big progress. Maybe start by having that conversation with your family tonight.
Or put together a basic emergency kit this weekend?
Or even just download the Frederick County EOP and, give it a skim. Any step you take is a step in the right direction.
And remember, preparedness isn't about living in fear. It's about empowerment. It's about knowing you have the tools and knowledge to face whatever, comes your way.
Exactly. It's about building a stronger, more resilient you and a more resilient community.
Well said. This deep dive has been a real eye-opener for me. I'm starting to see the world through a different lens, more aware of the potential risks, but also more confident in my ability to prepare for them.
Me too. It's fascinating to peek behind the curtain and see the level of thought and planning that goes into keeping a community safe.
And the best part is, it's not just about surviving a disaster. It's about thriving in the aftermath. It's about bouncing back, stronger than before.
And that's a message we can all get behind. So to our listeners, we challenge you. What one small step can you take today to be more prepared?
Share your ideas with us on social media. Let's create a conversation and inspire each other to build a more resilient future.
Because together we can weather any storm. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.